I'm 10 years old, and I'm walking to the doctor's surgery with my mum and my little sister. We've just moved there to this predominantly white village in Derbyshire. And we walk into the surgery, and we go to the reception, and my mum asks the receptionist, "Can I get my daughters registered?" The receptionist frowns at her and asks her to repeat herself. So she says again, "Can I get my daughters registered?" And then again, the receptionist asks her to repeat herself. And again like that, until she finally says to my mum, "Can't you speak in English?" Thing is, Mum was speaking in English, the best that she could. English isn't her first language. She grew up speaking Swahili and Gujarati. She was born in Uganda. When Mum was a kid in Uganda, Idi Amin took power. What followed were human rights abuses, political corruption, and oppression. In 1971, he declared what he called an economic war, including a set of policies designed to take away the land and the property of the Asians and the Europeans living in the country. Uganda's 80,000 Asians had moved there when the place was a British colony. Now they were given 90 days to leave. My mum's family had to leave everything behind, their business, home, mum's school, her friends, drop everything and just walk away. Years later, my mum and dad got married and came to the UK. Now, the UK was a hostile place for people coming into the country. But what's important to remember is that after the Second World War, the UK government had invited Commonwealth citizens to come to the country and to fill in labour skills like the NHS, public transport. So naturally, they thought that they'd be welcome, but they got a lot of surprises when they arrived. The cold, for one. There are these amazing photos of that generation coming off the planes with their beautiful saris billowing in the wind, absolutely freezing. They just didn't know how cold it gets in England. But the reception was even colder. You see, the truth was that these people had been exiled from their countries, and it linked back to the British Empire. But the propaganda was that they were flooding the country and taking over. My dad, with a science degree, could only get factory work. So the two of them worked their socks off until they had enough to buy a shop. And so there we are in this village where people had barely seen the color of brown skin. And there we are in the doctor's surgery, and my mum's voiceless because the receptionist has taken her voice away from her by refusing to listen. And so we turn around and go back home and tell my dad that we couldn't get registered. Now, that's not one of the worst things that happened in those years, but for some reason, that experience really stayed with me. That day, we were told that our difference was our weakness. And I carried on hearing that echoed to me as I grew up, every time I came across somebody who didn't fit what society deems as normal. I was reminded of it last year with Belinda. Belinda's mum, Mary, has a 45-degree curve in her spine and severe joint facet deterioration. It means she uses a wheelchair. Now, last year, Mary went to visit Belinda as she was finishing her first year of university in London. And what was supposed to be a lovely weekend for the family turned into a humiliating ordeal. The apps they were using to get around the city didn't take them on wheelchair-friendly routes. See, while Google Maps was able to identify the wheelchair-accessible stations, once they left the station, they were on their own. Can you imagine trekking around a big city like London, going 40 minutes to get to one destination, only to be faced with a footbridge, have to go all the way back again, hours wasted like that? It was time-consuming and degrading for Belinda and her mum. Belinda was furious. She got home, but instead of accepting that this was their weakness, instead of letting it make her voiceless, she made her voice louder. She started a petition calling on Google Maps to make their app fully accessible. And that's when I came across her story. See, every day I see people like Belinda starting petitions and rejecting the idea that they're weak, rejecting the notion that their difference makes them wrong because society has told them that they're in the minority. Months later, Belinda got a phone call from Google. They invited her in for a meeting. That could have been really scary. You know, Belinda, finishing her first year at university, invited in to meet these Google execs. But Belinda felt powerful because 300,014 people had signed her petition. And so she walked into that meeting with 300,014 people behind her. Now, maybe they were going to flatter her, make sure that she would go away, but Belinda had other ideas. What happened after that meeting was a continued conversation back and forth between Belinda and Google. And then something amazing happened last month. Google got in touch and told her that they'd be making their app accessible, starting with some of the biggest cities: Tokyo, Paris, New York, and London. So now on your way home, you can get a fully accessible, wheelchair-friendly route home. Now, things have changed a lot since I was younger. Unlike me, Belinda could go home, open her laptop, and transfer her frustration into this petition. Because the internet has leveled out the playing field for anyone who feels that they're different. It's made it so much more effective to have your voice heard. And it's made it so much more accessible. And it's opened up a whole world of campaigning to people who never thought of themselves as campaigners. People like Luke. So that's Luke on the left. And there he is with his best mate, Brian. Luke grew up in Wolverhampton. Brian was abandoned in Zimbabwe until he was 6, until a British family came across him. By the time he was 15, he was adopted and living in the UK. But it wasn't until he was making his university application that he found out that there was a Home Office error when he'd moved here and that he had the incorrect status. Now, Luke had seen Brian work his socks off to get 3 A stars and 1 A to get into Oxford University. For someone in Brian's shoes, so hard to speak up. And for someone like Luke, who would listen to some kid in Wolverhampton, especially not the Home Office? But knowing that his friend could lose everything and that he could lose his friend, Luke couldn't be quiet. So he started a campaign to get the Home Office to urgently review Brian's status. In just 1 week, over 100,000 people signed that petition. The story was covered in practically every media outlet. Politicians from across the political spectrum were speaking up on behalf of Brian. Even the police and crime commissioner of their area tweeted at the Home Office, urging them to review Brian's status. Now, before all of this happened, Luke said he thought that campaigners were people who hugged trees. But by speaking up, he proved to everyone, including himself, that he couldn't be ignored. 1 week later, the Home Office had reviewed their decision and given Brian his correct status, and he's now studying chemistry at Oxford University. So there's Belinda, Brian, and Luke. When you start to look around you, you realize that the real heroes in society are the people who look like you and me. This is Farmer. Farmer grew up in the British Somali community in Bristol. Now, that community is at risk of female genital mutilation. Every year, 24,000 girls are at risk in this country. Some at risk at home, some at risk of being sent away, some as young as 5. The summer is known as the cutting season, when girls can be sent away for the procedure so that they can be returned back for school to start in September. A farmer cared passionately about this and about the fact that this was happening in her community and she wanted it to stop. But the community farmer's from has long been ignored in this country. But she wanted to speak up. And the thing is, farmer had the power of the internet at her fingertips. So she started a petition calling on the government to address female genital mutilation by writing to all schools. She wanted teachers to know what the warning signs were so that girls could be stopped from being sent away. Farmer was 17 at the time. Someone like Farmer isn't supposed to come head-to-head with the Secretary of State for Education, but that's exactly what happened. Her petition grew, and it threw open the government doors. She got invited for a meeting with the Secretary of State. When she walked into that meeting, there was one expert in the room, and it was Farmer. Nobody else there knew the realities of female genital mutilation. No one else there had the passion and the power that Farmer held. She asked the Secretary of State, "Will you write to all schools?" He avoided the question, got to the end of the meeting, but Farmer refused to let him leave. She refused to let the Secretary of State leave the room for his next meeting. And she kept on asking him. And so what could he do? He had to agree. Farmer said afterwards, "Before all of this, I was always the one in the background. I never knew how much power I hold." The thing is, it's our experiences that is the power. It's your superpower. We just don't know it because society has a really limited idea of what strength is. We're told that power is to be a wealthy white man. But what if we disrupt that idea and step into our weakness? I apologize if you're a wealthy white man in this room. Many, many years after I was in that doctor's surgery, the world has transformed. The internet has given us the access to tools to amplify our voices, access social media and information on an incredible scale. Now, I'm a writer and a campaigner, and I use my voice to amplify the voices of people like Farmer and Luke and Brian and Belinda. You see, if it wasn't for Belinda and Mary, one of the biggest tech companies in the world wouldn't have made a vital change to their product. If it wasn't for Luke, the accidental campaigner, his friend Brian wouldn't be at Oxford University right now. He might not even be in the country. If it wasn't for Farmer speaking up about what was happening in her community, the government wouldn't have taken such a radical step in education. And if it wasn't for that day in that surgery, I don't think I'd be telling you this story here today. And the thing is, me, Belinda, Luke, Brian, Farmer, we're not the exception. Everybody here in this room has been told or made to feel at some point that you're different. But this idea of the norm, this wealthy white man whose shadow we're all in, he's the minority. So we've got this amazing opportunity with the internet at our fingertips. Will we use our experiences, our differences, our weakness to make us voiceless? Or will we let it become our megaphone? Thank you.